Sujin had ordered the deaths of 31 men. He remembered each one, not with guilt, but the way a surgeon remembers incisions. Clean. Necessary. Forgotten by morning. He had never once looked away. Until a 7-year-old girl in a faded red hoodie pressed a blood-sticky locket into his palm and whispered, "You look like someone God sends when he's too busy." And Sujin, the man whose name made Seoul's underground go silent, couldn't move. The forest path off Hongang's eastern bank was not on any map his enemies knew about. That was the point. Sujin used it precisely because nothing innocent ever wandered here. No joggers, no lovers, no children pressing wildflowers into their coat pockets. It was a corridor of dead leaves and controlled silence, and he walked it every Thursday after a collection meeting, alone, because even kings needed one road where no one bowed. His men knew not to follow. The city knew not to ask. 3 blocks away, Seoul breathed its usual Thursday chaos: food vendors, taxi horns, 1,000 overlapping lives. But here, between these trees, the only sound was the faint percussion of his own footsteps and the distant hum of the Han River moving without him. He had his phone to his ear. His second-in-command, Dae-ho, was mid-sentence about a shipment delay. Sujin wasn't listening. Something had broken the silence ahead. Not a sound, exactly. More like the shape of a sound, ragged, rhythmic, the kind of breathing that lives just on the other side of desperate. He rounded the bend, and his hand had already moved to the inside of his jacket before his mind caught up with what his eyes were seeing. A woman. Grey sweatshirt. Curled on the cold asphalt like she had simply run out of reasons to stand. A dark bloom spreading from her left side, soaking through the fabric in a way that told him everything a doctor could have confirmed. She had minutes, not hours. Her sneakers were scuffed down to the white rubber sole. Her face was pale and tilted toward the gravel, eyes closed, as though she had decided to be very quiet about dying. And kneeling over her, one small hand pressed hard against the wound the way she must have seen in a movie or a nightmare, was a child. Red hoodie. Dark jeans. Worn-out sneakers with white laces, one of them untied. She looked up. Sujin had stared down loaded guns. He had watched men crumble under his silence. He had sat across interrogation tables from people who had trained their entire lives not to flinch, and he had made them flinch. The girl did not flinch. She looked at him the way people look at emergency exits, not with admiration, not with fear, but with the terrifying, unquestioning certainty that he was the way out. "Mister," she said. Her voice was steadier than it had any right to be. "My mommy is bleeding and I don't have a phone and I already tried to stop it but it won't stop and..." She swallowed. Hard. Like she was physically pushing the panic back down. "I don't need you to be nice. I just need you to help her." Sujin's phone was still at his ear. Dae-ho was still talking. He hung up without a word. Later, much later, his men would replay the security footage from the North Trail camera. They would watch their boss, a man who had never once knelt for anything, lower himself into a crouch on cold forest asphalt. They would watch him press 2 fingers to the woman's throat, check his watch, and then, with the kind of precision that had nothing to do with mercy and everything to do with habit, begin issuing commands into his phone like a man rerouting a war. What the camera didn't catch was the moment before that. The half-second where Sujin looked at the child's face, looked down at the woman bleeding into the ground, and understood, with a cold clarity that felt uncomfortably close to conscience, that the bullet that had found this woman had been traveling in an arc that began with him. He hadn't pulled the trigger. But he had built the world that loaded the gun. The girl was still watching him. Waiting. Her small hand still pressed against her mother's side, her knuckles white with the effort of believing that pressure alone could hold a life in place. "What's your name?" he asked. Not because it mattered strategically. He didn't know why he asked. "Eva," she said. "Eva." He said it once, the way you test the weight of something before you decide whether to carry it. "Your mother is going to need surgery. Not at a hospital." Eva blinked. "Why not a hospital?" "Because hospitals ask questions and right now questions will cost her time she doesn't have." A pause. The wind moved through the trees. Somewhere above them, a bird made a single, brief sound and went quiet. "Okay," Eva said. "Just that. Okay." As though she had done a calculation behind those steady eyes and decided, based on no evidence except the way he hadn't run, that he was trustworthy. It was the most unearned trust Sujin had ever been given. It was, without question, the heaviest thing he had ever held. He stood. He made the calls. And as his men materialized from the tree line with a stretcher, none of them questioned why he kept on hand. Sujin looked once more at the small girl in the red hoodie, who had not moved her hand from her mother's side, not even now, and felt something he had no clinical name for shift behind his ribs. 31 men. He had never looked away. He was looking now. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment below to tell me where you're watching from. I would genuinely love to say hello to you and know just how far our story has traveled. Sujin knew it before his men said a word. He knew it the way you know a storm is coming not from the clouds but from the particular stillness that arrives before them. The air going flat, the birds going quiet, the world holding its breath. He stood over Lucy's unconscious body while his men swept the tree line, and he looked at the entry wound the way a scholar looks at a sentence he has read before. The angle. The caliber. The clean, deliberate placement. 2 inches left of center, just below the 5th rib. Not a panicked shot. Not a warning. A signature. Someone had stood in these trees and waited. Someone who knew his Thursday route. Someone who had watched him walk this path before and decided that today, they would send him a message written in a stranger's blood. His jaw tightened. Eva was beside him, her hand still pressed to her mother's side, her eyes tracking his face the way a compass needle tracks north, constantly, involuntarily, looking for direction. She had said nothing since his men appeared. She had simply watched, and stayed, and kept her small hand where it was. She's losing pressure, his field medic, Rio, said quietly behind him. I know. Sujin didn't look up. Get the van. One of his men, a broad, silent figure named Tai, hesitated. Boss. If we move her wrong. She dies here if we don't. Sujin finally stood, and the finality in his voice closed the conversation the way a door closes, completely, without echo. He looked down at Eva. Stay close to me. Don't let go of my jacket. Eva reached up and took a fistful of his sleeve without a single moment of hesitation. He noted that. He didn't examine why it mattered to him. The van came. Lucy was lifted with a care that surprised even his own men, Sujin directing each movement with a precision that had nothing to do with sentiment and everything to do with the fact that this woman was now, whether he had chosen it or not, his responsibility. The forest closed behind them. The asphalt kept its dark stain. Somewhere in those trees, someone was watching him drive away, thinking they had rattled him. They had made a far more serious miscalculation. They had made it personal. The ghost clinic sat beneath a repurposed dry cleaning facility in the Koreatown corridor of Los Angeles. 3 levels underground, accessed through a service elevator disguised as a utility closet, known to exactly 11 people in the continental United States. Sujin had built it 7 years ago, not out of paranoia, but out of arithmetic. His world produced injuries that public hospitals produced questions about. Questions produced investigations. Investigations produced exposure. Exposure produced war. The clinic was cleaner, quieter, and better equipped than most surgical suites in Cedars-Sinai. He had made sure of that, not for himself, but because men who worked for him bled on his behalf, and he paid his debts in full. Tonight, it received its first civilian. The staff worked without speaking. Dr. Noro, a former Johns Hopkins trauma surgeon who had come to Sujin 3 years ago with debts that would have buried her, assessed Lucy in under 90 seconds, called for a blood panel, and disappeared behind the surgical doors without once looking at the child standing in the corridor. Eva looked at the doors. Then at Sujin. Is she going to be okay? Sujin looked at the closed doors. He had learned, a long time ago, that the most dangerous thing a man in his position could do was promise something he couldn't deliver. False mercy was worse than honest silence. It left people broken in a different way. Dr. Noro is the best surgeon I have ever paid, he said. That is all I can tell you right now. Eva considered this with the seriousness of someone much older. That's not a yes. No, he said. It isn't. She nodded slowly, like she had expected exactly that answer and had simply needed to hear it confirmed. Then she sat down on the corridor bench, folded her hands in her lap, and went very still, the way children go still when they are privately falling apart and have decided not to show it. Soo-jin stood against the opposite wall. His men were stationed above. Rio was running prints on the bullet casing. The facility hummed with its underground frequency, and the fluorescent lights were the particular shade of white that belongs only to places where people are fighting to stay alive. He watched Eva not cry. He had seen hardened men cry in this corridor. He had watched soldiers, enforcers, collectors, men whose fear looked like fury until it didn't, come undone in this exact hallway. The child sat with her hands folded and stared at the door and did not cry. He didn't know what to do with that. So he did the only thing he knew how to do. He pulled out his phone and went back to work. 72 hours. That was what Dr. Noro gave Lucy, not as a promise, but as a window. The next 72 hours are the margin, she said, meeting Soo-jin's eyes with the flat directness he had hired her for. If she stabilizes, we have a conversation. If she doesn't, she didn't finish. She didn't need to. 10%, Soo-jin repeated. On the high end, Noro said. And walked back through the doors. Soo-jin stood with that number the way you stand with a verdict. 10%. He had worked with worse odds. He had built an empire on the logic that probability was simply a dare with mathematics attached. What he had not accounted for was explaining 10% to a 7-year-old. Eva received the number with the same terrible stillness. Then she looked at him and said, "What does 90% feel like for you?" He almost didn't answer. "Manageable," he finally said. "Then I want to feel that," she said. "Can I stay with you?" It was not a reasonable request. His facility was not a place for children. His hours were not structured around small people with questions and needs and untied shoelaces. He had 3 traitors to identify, a shipment to redirect, and a war beginning to assemble itself on the edges of his organization. "Yes," he said. He didn't examine that either. For the next 2 days, Eva moved through his world like a quiet shadow. She slept on the cot Rio set up in the side room. She ate whatever his men brought without complaint. She asked questions about the equipment with a focused curiosity that made Noro answer her, despite herself. And wherever Soo-jin moved, down corridors, into briefing rooms, through the facility's long concrete halls, she followed, one hand occasionally finding the sleeve of his jacket the way a small boat finds a dock. His men didn't know what to make of it. Soo-jin didn't explain it. He simply let her follow, and told himself it was because she had nowhere else to go, and ignored the part of himself that had started listening for her footsteps. The bullet casing told him everything. Rio laid the report on the steel table on the morning of the second day: ballistics, rifling pattern, serial trace, and Soo-jin read it once, slowly, with the particular stillness that preceded his most dangerous decisions. The round was a proprietary 9mm subsonic, custom-loaded, suppressor-optimized, manufactured in a batch of exactly 200 that Soo-jin himself had procured 18 months ago for his inner circle's personal sidearms. Not available on the market. Not traceable to any public supplier. Which meant the person who had fired it had received it directly from him. He set the report down. He thought about the angle of the shot. The position in the trees. The timing, Thursday 4 p.m., a window that only his inner circle knew was his unguarded hour. He thought about who had stood in that tree line with a weapon he had personally supplied, waited for him to round that bend, and fired at a woman in a grey sweatshirt because she had been walking in his path at the exact wrong moment. Dae-ho. His second-in-command. 15 years. The man who had stood at his right hand through 3 territory wars, 2 federal investigations, and the night Soo-jin had built this organization from nothing into the most quietly powerful Korean network on the West Coast. Dae-ho, who had been mid-sentence on the phone when Soo-jin had heard the sound that wasn't quite a sound. Mid-sentence. Already calling. Already establishing his alibi, his presence, his innocence. Because a man guilty of sending a shooter doesn't go quiet before the shot. He calls. He talks. He fills the silence with his own voice so there is no room for suspicion. Soo-jin folded the report. He placed it in his inside jacket pocket. He sat for a moment with his hands flat on the table, breathing evenly, and then he stood up and went to check on Lucy. The revenge could wait 24 hours. It would be cleaner that way. In 7 years of operating from this facility, he had never needed to. His men understood, without instruction, that the lower conference room was not a space for casual entry. It was where decisions were made that altered the composition of his organization, where men spoke in half sentences because the full versions were too dangerous to have on record. He had forgotten about Eva. More precisely, he had made the error of assuming she was asleep. She wasn't asleep. She had followed the sound of voices the way children follow anything that suggests something important is happening, and she had pushed open the heavy door with both hands and walked into a room containing Sujin, 4 of his senior lieutenants, a detailed map of Daecho's known locations, and enough implied violence to rearrange the western seaboard. The room went completely silent. 4 of the most dangerous men in Los Angeles stared at a small girl in a red hoodie holding a granola bar she had found in the kitchen upstairs. Eva looked at the map, looked at the men, looked at Sujin. "Sorry," she said, not sounding particularly sorry. "I got hungry and I heard talking and I thought maybe you were ordering food." No one moved. Kwon, Sujin's longest-serving lieutenant, a man with a scar that ran from his left ear to his jaw and a professional reputation that made weapons dealers nervous, looked at the child, looked at Sujin, and waited. Sujin looked at Eva for a long moment. Then he pulled out the chair beside him and said, "Sit down." Kwon's expression didn't change. But something in his eyes shifted, a fractional recalibration, the way a compass adjusts when the magnetic field moves. He had served Sujin for 11 years. He had never seen him pull out a chair for anyone. Eva Saturday. She opened her granola bar. The crinkling of the wrapper was the only sound in the room. "Gentlemen," Sujin said, as though nothing unusual had occurred, "we continue." They continued. And Eva sat beside him, eating her granola bar with quiet focus, occasionally glancing at the map with those steady, watchful eyes that missed. Sujin was beginning to understand absolutely nothing. After the meeting, when the room had cleared, Kwon lingered in the doorway. He looked at Eva, who had fallen asleep in the chair, her head resting against Sujin's arm, and then at Sujin. He didn't say anything. He simply nodded, once, with the weight of a man who has just watched something irreversible happen and has chosen to honor it. Sujin looked down at the child sleeping against his sleeve. He didn't move his arm. The hunt for Daeho could wait another hour. He opened the locket at 2 a.m., alone in the facility's small back office, because some things require the privacy of silence. It was a simple oval piece, tarnished silver, the kind sold at airport gift shops and street markets and every modest jewelry counter in every city where people live without excess. The clasp was stiff from the blood that had dried into it. He worked it open with the methodical patience he applied to everything, and when it opened, he sat very still for a long time. On the left side, a photograph of Lucy and Eva, a candid shot, the two of them laughing at something off camera, Lucy's arm around Eva's shoulders, both of them wearing the uncomplicated expression of people who are, in that exact moment, completely safe. On the right side, a name, engraved in small, careful letters, in Korean. Park Sue. He set the locket down on the desk. Park Sue had been his mother's name. He didn't pick it back up for a long time. He sat with the coincidence, if it was a coincidence, and let it do what it needed to do to him. He was not a man who believed in signs. He was not a man who assigned meaning to the random intersections of a chaotic world. But he was also not a man who could look at his mother's name engraved in a locket pressed into his hand by a child whose mother was bleeding in his forest path and feel nothing. He felt something. He didn't have a name for it. It sat somewhere between grief and recognition, between the past he had sealed behind 15 years of controlled violence and the present that kept refusing, apparently, to leave him alone. He picked up the locket. He closed it. He placed it in his breast pocket, directly over his chest, and went back to work. Word travels in this world the way weather travels, invisibly, rapidly, and always ahead of the damage it carries. By the third day, Sujin's rivals had heard the story. Not accurately. Accuracy was never the point in the networks that passed intelligence between competing organizations, but in broad strokes that were, ironically, more dangerous than the precise version. Sujin has a weakness. A woman and a child. He has gone soft. In Koreatown's opposing faction, led by a man named Hyun-suk who had been waiting 3 years for exactly this kind of opening, the intelligence landed like a lit match on dry paper. Hyun-suk was not reckless. Reckless men didn't survive in his position, but he was opportunistic with the efficiency of a surgeon, and what his scouts were describing sounded unmistakably like an unguarded flank. He called a meeting. He made a plan. He had no idea that Soo-jin was already aware of the meeting, aware of the plan, and had been tracking Hyun-suk's communications for 48 hours through a tap that Ryo had placed on his network 6 months ago as a precaution. But the information came with a timestamp that changed everything. Hyun-suk wasn't moving on Soo-jin's main facility. He was moving on the safe house on the east side of the city, where Lucy had been transferred 2 days ago for her recovery phase, where the power grid ran on a private generator, where Eva slept in a chair beside her mother's bed every night and called Soo-jin's phone every morning at 7 to report that her mother's hands were warm. They are going after the safe house. Soo-jin read the intelligence report and experienced something he had not felt in 15 years. Fear. Not for himself. He was already moving before Ryo finished the sentence. They hit the safe house at midnight, which told Soo-jin everything he needed to know about Hyun-suk's tactical mind. Midnight was theatrical, not strategic. It was the choice of a man who had watched too many films about power and not enough mornings sitting with the consequences of it. Soo-jin's men were already in position by 11. The exchange was brief, violent, and entirely controlled. His security dismantled the assault team with the quiet efficiency of people who had been told, with considerable specificity, by their employer that this was not a negotiable outcome. Hyun-suk's men were disarmed, detained, and separated before they reached the ground floor. But one of them got to the generator. It was a single gunshot, stray, panicked, the last act of a man who understood he had failed and decided to take something with him. The bullet found the primary power coupling, and the facility lights went down in a single, breathless instant. Lucy was on a ventilator. Soo-jin heard the monitors flatline through his earpiece and was running before the echo of the shot finished traveling. He hit the generator room at full sprint, passing 2 of his own men without slowing, and found the backup coupling housing with his hands because the emergency lights hadn't engaged yet and the room was completely dark. He had installed this generator himself. He had tested this coupling himself. His hands knew the housing the way his hands knew everything he had built. By touch, by repetition, by the muscle memory of a man who trusted nothing he hadn't personally verified. He found the bypass. He connected it. He heard the generator catch, heard the power surge back through the building, and stood in the dark for exactly 3 seconds with his hands braced against the housing and his eyes closed. Then his phone rang. "Her monitors are back," Ryo said. "She's stable." Soo-jin breathed. Then he straightened his jacket, checked his cufflinks, and went to deal with Hyun-suk. Dae-ho was waiting for him at the overlook point above the LA River Basin, because Soo-jin had sent him the coordinates himself, and because a man who had betrayed his employer for 15 years understood, when summoned, that the only options remaining were confession or flight, and Dae-ho had always lacked the courage to run. He looked smaller than Soo-jin remembered. Guilt does that to people. "How long?" Soo-jin asked. 8 months, Dae-ho said. He didn't bother with denial. That, at least, Soo-jin respected. Hyun-suk. He offered relocation. A piece of the northern route. Dae-ho looked at the river. "I was tired." "You shot a woman," Soo-jin said. "A woman and her daughter were walking in the path you chose." "I know." And the 2 words carried something genuine, not remorse exactly, but the particular exhaustion of a man who has been living inside a mistake for months and has simply run out of ways to justify it to himself. Soo-jin looked at him for a long time. His gun was at his hip. He was aware of it the way you're aware of a door, present, available, requiring only a decision. He had made this kind of decision 31 times before. He knew its weight. He knew its aftermath. He knew exactly the equation of silence and erasure that followed. He thought about Eva's voice. "You look like someone God sends when he's too busy." He thought about his mother's name in a locket pressed against his chest. He reached into his jacket and produced not his weapon but his phone. He dialed a number he had quietly established 3 months ago, A contact in the federal task force that had been building a case against West Coast trafficking networks for 2 years, a contact he had cultivated as insurance and never expected to use. He handed the phone to Dae-ho. "Talk," he said. Dae-ho looked at the phone. Looked at Soo-jin. "You're not going to?" "No," Soo-jin said. "I'm not." A pause. "That would make me what I've always been. I'm trying something different." He left Dae-ho standing at the overlook with the phone pressed to his ear, the city lights below them like a second sky, and walked back to his car without looking back. The cycle ends where you choose to end it. He had chosen. Lucy opened her eyes on a Tuesday morning, 11 days after the forest path and the blood on the asphalt and the small girl who had held a life in place with her bare hands. Eva was in the chair beside her bed, asleep, one arm stretched out so her fingers rested near her mother's hand, close, but not quite touching, as though she had fallen asleep still in the act of reaching. Soo-jin stood in the doorway. He watched Lucy orient herself, the slow, blinking process of consciousness reassembling its geography. Ceiling. Room. The hum of machines. The weight of her own breathing. And then her daughter's face, slack and peaceful in sleep, and the particular undoing that happens to a mother's expression when she finds her child safe after imagining the worst. Lucy's eyes filled. She didn't make a sound. She simply turned her hand, palm up, and waited. Eva woke 3 minutes later with the instinct of someone who had been listening even in sleep. She looked at her mother's open eyes and open hand, and she made a sound that Soo-jin had never heard before, something that was not quite a word, not quite a cry, but entirely, unmistakably, the sound of a wound closing. He stepped back from the doorway and gave them the room. He was in his car, making calls, when Rio knocked on the window. "The acquisition paperwork came through," Rio said. "Northgate Memorial is yours as of this morning." Northgate Memorial, the hospital that had been listed as Lucy's nearest emergency facility on the night of the shooting. The hospital whose billing department had, according to their own public records, sent 3 families to collections in the past year for trauma care they could not afford. The hospital whose administrator had once said, in a recorded board meeting, that the emergency ward was a liability corridor. Soo-jin signed the transfer document on the hood of his car. Then he attached a secondary document, a trust deed, establishing a board of oversight for the facility's charitable operations, naming the primary ward in honor of an entity that did not yet know she had an entity. Eva's ward. She was 7. She would grow into it. Rio looked at the documents. Then at Soo-jin. "You know she's going to ask you 100 questions about what this means." "Yes," Soo-jin said. "And you're going to answer them." It wasn't a question. Soo-jin looked at it briefly and answered it anyway. "Every single one," he said. He drove back to the safe house. Eva was in the hallway when he arrived, Lucy's hand in hers, both of them standing in the thin afternoon light that came through the corridor window and turned everything it touched a particular shade of gold. Eva looked up when she heard his footsteps. She didn't say anything. She simply held up her free hand. Soo-jin looked at it. Looked at her. Looked at the woman beside her, who regarded him with the quiet, searching expression of someone who is still assembling the story of how they got here, and who has not yet decided whether the man standing in the doorway is something to be afraid of or something to be grateful for. He walked over. He took Eva's hand. She squeezed it once, firmly, the way you seal something you intend to keep. And Soo-jin, who had ordered the deaths of 31 men, who had built a kingdom on silence and controlled violence, who had walked a forest path alone every Thursday because he had believed, for 15 years, that connection was a liability he could not afford, stood in the hallway light and felt the architecture of his life rearrange itself around a 7-year-old girl's grip. He had come to this city to survive. It appeared he was going to have to learn something harder. He was going to have to learn how to stay. And that is where Soo-jin's old story ends, and his real one begins. If this story moved something in you, hit subscribe and come back for what comes next. And drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I genuinely want to say hello to you, because the fact that this story found you, wherever you are, means everything to me. This isn't just content. This is us, building something together, one chapter at a time. See you in the next one.